Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Clarkson Pereira, and I'm the Executive Director of GVPedia. Thank you again for being here today. I'm sure we'll have some more people join us over the next couple of minutes, but we wanted to get started so we can be respectful of your time. Today, we are going to be discussing data and its importance in the gun violence prevention movement. But just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This session is being recorded and all participants are currently on mute. Some of you did submit some questions in the RSVP form. So after the presentation, we will get to those questions. And if you have any other questions that come up during the session, if you want to put them in the chat box, Devin and I will do the best that we can to get to all of your questions. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Devin, who is the founder of GVPedia. But first, just wanted to give you a brief introduction as to who we are in case you haven't joined us before. So GVPedia is a comprehensive resource providing public access to our gun study database, which is the largest in existence, currently including over 1,000 academic studies. And we provide access to GVP University, which is a repository of white papers and fact sheets about gun violence. Both the database and the university are easily searchable by subject matter and provide an excellent resource for educational and advocacy purposes. And GVPedia is now also home to the Facts About Firearm Policy initiative, which we launched a couple months ago. As I like to say in my elevator pitch to folks, we exist to provide information to elected officials, to staffers, to educators, to advocates in a nonpartisan manner to make sure that any legislation that's being written and voted on is based on the facts. So now Devin and I are going to lead you in a conversation on data. Hi, Devin. How are you doing today?
Hello, doing pretty well. Great to be here and thank all of you for joining.
All right. So just to get started, I know you're going to share your screen here, Devin. Perfect. Okay, so just to get started, what are some good data sources that folks in the movement can use?
Yeah, so today I want to talk about what good data sources are, how best to use them, how to counter misinformation with such data sources, and then finally what GVPedia's role is in data and exploring or showing a new project that we're going to be unveiling in the next few months. So I'm really excited about that. But to start off with just an overview of the existing data sources and how best to use them. So the first one I want to mention, and one of the ones, spoiler alert, that GVPedia is going to be using in our data project is quite consistently is the Gun Violence Archive. If you haven't heard about the Gun Violence Archive before, it's an excellent resource. It provides near real-time data on gun violence. It includes both deaths and injuries. The data can be searched all the way down to the street level, unlike government agency data sources. You can get a block-by-block view of gun violence using the Gun Violence Archive. They have more than 50 incident characteristics, allowing you to search quite carefully in terms of what incidents you're looking for and quite precisely. They use more than 7,500 media and police sources. That was as of last year. They might have even more now. And they aren't a government agency, meaning that if you want to request data from them, you'll be able to do so rather promptly, and it's continuously updated, and any sort of recommendations for improving it, or if they've missed an incident, you're able to quickly contact them and they're able to rectify that. Some of the downsides of the Gun Violence Archive, so where you need to be careful in using the data, it does not collect suicide data. The suicides that it does collect are in murder suicides. So if you're looking for an overall gun deaths number, just be wary that the Gun Violence Archive does not have those figures. Now, it does provide an estimate for suicides in the current year, but for the true number to come out, they have to rely, like everybody else, on the CDC. And that has a couple-year lag, as we're going to discuss. If the media or police does not report on a gun violence incident, it's not going to show up on Gun Violence Archive. So there is the potential risk of unreported incidents not appearing. And due to this, there's a decent chance that the Gun Violence Archive might be missing some unintentional shootings where either somebody's injured and the police never pick it up, or like shots are fired, but nobody's injured, and so it goes unreported. So the Gun Violence Archive is probably going to be missing some of those incidents. It does have a short history. It was founded in 2013 and started reporting full data in 2014. So doing long-term studies with Gun Violence Archive data can be more challenging because typically in those studies you want like 5 years of data at least on either side of some sort of gun law. But it has been 7 years now. And so we're getting to the point where there's enough Gun Violence Archive data to start showing trends and doing robust analyses on it. It does not have any data on the race of perpetrators or victims. This was done quite consciously by the Gun Violence Archive because oftentimes in media and initial police reports, that sort of data is not reported. So if you're looking for that sort of data, particularly with regard to deaths, you're going to have to rely on the CDC or FBI data for that. And finally, while it's a pro, it's also a con. That's not a government agency, meaning that there's still questions by some out there over how reputable the source is. Now, I consider the Gun Violence Archive to be an excellent source that should definitely be used. But there have been some researchers in the past who have been hesitant, at least at the beginning, to use Gun Violence Archive data, simply because it's not a government agency like the CDC or FBI. So there's still that hurdle to overcome. But overall, the Gun Violence Archive is just an excellent resource that should be used. Going into more traditional resources, you have the CDC data in their Whiskers database. I had what Whiskers stands for written down somewhere, but all you have to do is Google this and it will come up. Some of the benefits of CDC Whiskers: it has the most accurate death data. If you're going to be using data on gun deaths in the US, unless you have access to like academic sources of FBI data, CDC is going to be the way to go in terms of getting death data. It also has detailed demographic data. Unlike the Gun Violence Archive, the CDC does track race. And so you can get detailed breakdowns of that. And it has more than 30 years of records, meaning there's a very long time horizon to study the data and look at trends and what impact certain events had on the data. Downsides is that it has a 2-year lag time. So right now the CDC's reporting, I believe, 2019 data. And it's obviously the year 2021 and a lot happened in 2020 that we would be interested in knowing about, but we're going to have to wait a whole nother year to get the death data from the CDC. The CDC data is not granular geographically or by incident type. Basically, you can tell whether the incident involved a gun and what state it is in. And beyond that, there's not nearly as much. Like, it does break down homicide, suicide, unintentional deaths. But you can't tell whether like the shooting occurred at a bar or club or occurred in a mall, for example. It just does not have that level of detail. The CDC injury data is inaccurate. The CDC has admitted as such and that they're working on it, but it was based on surveys of hospitals. They had like 30 sample hospitals and then extrapolated from that. And the numbers, particularly over the past 5 years or so, have gone fairly off course. And so it's widely accepted now in academia that the injury data is problematic, and currently working on other sources for that injury data. I know Everytown released a report I believe it was earlier this year, looking at injury data that was pretty solid. FBI includes injury data. Gun Violence Archive provides injury data. And so there just needs to be more work done there. And hopefully it's resolved fully in the next couple of years. But until then, just be cautious when using CDC data, particularly with injuries. Death data is just fine. And the final potential issue with CDC data is that you have the risk of coroner misclassification. And this most often comes about with unintentional shootings, particularly involving children, being classified as homicides. There have been multiple in-depth investigative reports by various news outlets and academics that have found that this happens. So while the deaths are still recorded, the unintentional deaths portion of the CDC is an undercount. Many of those are being classified as homicides when they should instead be unintentional. The National Violent Death Reporting System, it has the most detailed data, both in terms of demographics and incident characteristics. While it doesn't have quite as many categories as the Gun Violence Archive, it does have very detailed data, government resource, and it's extremely accurate. It's been robustly tested over the years. And in terms of looking at data on deaths, it's probably the best one out there where the data is available. Part of the limitation for the NVDRs is where the data is available. It has a 3-year time lag, so it's even has a higher lag than the CDC data. It's not comprehensive, as in it's currently covering around 34 states, while I believe they've had the funding and go ahead to cover all states now. There's still that lag on the data. And also states have adopted it at different times, meaning it's not a continuous data set for its basket of states. So if your state is covered by the NVDRs and you have the data for a certain period of time, definitely take advantage of it because it's an excellent resource. Unfortunately, not all states can take advantage of the resource. It does focus on deaths, not injuries. And its history is short for many states, like some of them only have 1 or 2 years of data. But hopefully in the coming decade or so, all the states will have adopted it and it will be comprehensive and very useful at that point. But at this point, it's kind of an up and coming resource just due to its lack of comprehensiveness currently. The final governmental one I want to cover is the FBI data. So it has detailed breakdowns of crime that other resources just don't have. So if you're looking into aggravated assaults or robberies, the FBI is going to be your source. It has a long history of data going back many decades. So you're able to look at trends over time quite consistently. And it also has detailed demographic breakdowns like the CDC. So it's useful in that regard. The downsides of the FBI data and why I tend not to use it is it's not comprehensive. It's not comprehensive in unexpected ways, meaning that it's not voluntary reporting. So each local law enforcement can choose whether it submits the data to the FBI. So you can have holes in reporting that include entire states. I believe Alabama is one of those states that just does not report consistent data to the FBI. And within states as well, where you'll just have certain localities that don't report. And figuring out which localities have that issue can be quite difficult when going through the data. And the FBI also does not look at suicide. So while the FBI data can be useful in certain regards when looking at an overall national picture, if you want to see how many deaths occurred in the US in 2017, the CDC is going to be your source, not the FBI. In fact, one of the major mistakes people make with the FBI and CDC is they look at the CDC homicide number, then look at the FBI murder number and see that there's like a 2,000 or so difference there. And they assume the entire difference is therefore based on justified homicides. whereas a person is justified to shoot somebody else in self-defense, which is not the case. The gap there is because the FBI is not comprehensive. And so that's one mistake to be on the lookout for when people are using FBI or CDC data. The final source I want to cover are peer-reviewed journals. So peer-reviewed journals are excellent at interpreting data. They have access to data and statistics that the rest of us don't have unless you have major R programming skills or use data. The academics who publish in peer-reviewed journals are just going to be able to slice and dice the data in ways that you aren't going to be able to. They're also excellent at combining data sources and piecing them together to provide a fuller picture of what has occurred. And like 99.9% of the time in peer-reviewed journals, the authors of a peer-reviewed article are going to be subject matter experts. So they do know what they're writing about. And now this is different from law review journals, which while they can produce high quality research, it does not have the same rigor in checking the sources as peer review. It doesn't mean that if an article appears in a law review journal that it should be immediately discounted, but you do have to be careful about it. Some of the downsides of peer review journals is that substantial mistakes can still happen. Keep in mind that Gary Kleck's research on defensive gun use was all peer reviewed. John Lott's initial research was all peer reviewed. The study, to move off of gun violence for a second, the study that initially linked autism and vaccines was peer reviewed. And so while peer review is good, it still can let things through the cracks. And so simply because something was published in a peer reviewed journal does not mean that you should immediately accept its claims as true. Both the author and the journal matter. There are tons of peer reviewed journals out there, and many of them have no business being peer reviewed journals. So you want to make sure the journal itself has a long history of accurately providing good peer-reviewed articles. If it just was randomly created 5 years or so ago and accepts anything, that can be problematic. The studies are only as good as the data. One of the main issues plaguing gun violence prevention research is that the data has been of questionable quality in the past, to where there have been major data holes. Some of the data sets going down to the county level have been shown to be flawed. And so you can do a perfect study on data that just is not good. And therefore the study itself won't be good, even if it was done with the best methods available. Two of the issues that I found is that articles appearing in peer-reviewed journals are often treated without sufficient skepticism by the political left. You will see some research that will just come up with results that are nonsensical. For example, there was a study, I believe it was published in the Lancet 4 or 5 years or so ago, that found a massive reduction in gun violence due to micro-stamping bullets. Now, this is a problem because there's only a couple states out there that require micro-stamping of bullets. So it's a very small sample size. And even though I feel and many experts feel that micro-stamping is good and important, there's no way it would be responsible for a 20 to 30% reduction in homicides. And while I don't have the exact figures in front of me, this paper was indicating that that policy impact alone had that sort of effect, and that's very unlikely to be the case. And so if there's results that don't appear to match with common sense, be very careful with articles, even if they did pass through peer review. And finally, and problematically for outreach, they're treated with too much skepticism by people on the right. It's like, oh, those ivory tower liberals trying to tell me what to do with their data. And so like just bringing peer-reviewed articles to an argument about gun violence is unlikely to be sufficient most of the time.
Thank you for explaining all those nuances across all those various platforms that we look into for data. Those certainly aren't things, I don't know all those things off the top of my head. So it's good to be able to share that with advocates and those responsible for building legislation, because like you said, that we don't want to get a lot of pushback from folks. And so the more people can believe in the validity of what they're using and where they're getting it from, the better. So can you tell us about some of the potential pitfalls when using data?
Yeah, so some of the common ones I've seen, and these are oftentimes mistakes that even gun violence prevention advocates will make. It's not just mistakes that pro-gun advocates make. One of the main ones is ignoring the age of data. One of the prime examples of this, and thankfully this is how often this occurs has gone down in recent years, but I still see advocates saying that 40% of guns are sold in private sales, which is just not the case anymore. And even back when the data existed or was created, which was back in the mid 1990s, it wasn't exactly measuring private sales because not all states at that point had background check systems. So it was questionable whether that was actually what it was measuring. And it was more than 2 decades old. And more recent data from Harvard has indicated that it's around 20% occur through private sales. So the main takeaway here is if the data occurred or a study or data before the year 2000, you should treat it with heavy skepticism. It might have been the best data available at the time, but stuff has changed since the 1990s. So when looking at data, just do a quick check to see, like, hey, is this data actually current? Another mistake I've seen is misinterpreting data. So for example, domestic abuse is 5 times more likely to turn deadly when a firearm is present. This came from a study in, I believe it was the late 2000s, and is a good study. But oftentimes on social media graphics, you'll see that domestic abuse is 500% more likely to turn deadly. Well, the problem is 5 times does not equal 500%. It's actually 400% increase. And so simple data errors like that can cause problems for our messaging, as people on the other side point out, like, hey, you got this wrong, therefore why should I trust the rest of what you say? And so there's simple mistakes that we can easily correct and make sure we're not making them. The final mistake that I quite frequently see is overlooking the type of data. And this is one area where I tend to be more skeptical than some academics, but treat all survey data with extreme caution, particularly when it's of a statistically rare event. And here I'm going to define statistically rare event as something occurring to less than 5% of the survey population. So we see this with defensive gun use and the claim that 2.5 million defensive gun uses occur annually. That came from a survey from the 1990s, so old data, and it was a survey of 5,000 individuals, and of those 5,000, 66 had defensive gun use, which was around 1.3% of the US population, which extrapolates to 2.5 million. So, and the problem with those surveys, because methodologically, while there were some questions, like they still did what you're supposed to do in surveys generally, was that it was of a rare event and therefore could lead to extreme exaggeration of the data. So if it's of a survey, now gun ownership surveys and stuff like that, those can be fine, although you want to be careful when it breaks down to the state level, unless the survey was of those states specifically. When it's showing like 30, 40, 50% population having something, those are generally okay, but you should still treat them carefully and make sure they're from a reputable source, because there's a lot of ways to misuse survey data.
How can we spot misinformation when we are looking into gun violence data?
So the easiest way to do that is to initially check, is the data from a reputable source? So if it's in a peer-reviewed journal from authors from, say, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Southern California, basically a respected institution, particularly one that has a gun violence prevention program like Johns Hopkins, like those are going to be good sources generally. Now, occasionally there are mistakes, but if it's not from such a reputable source, you should treat it with extra caution. Step two is to look at whether the source actually claims what is being said. So oftentimes what happens is you'll see a claim made in an article or some sort of online graphic. And it's like, wow, that looks suspicious. Hopefully they provide a footnote where they say they got the data, which is typically another article, which links to another article. And eventually you get back to the source of that data, which from there you can tell like, hey, are they actually claiming this? Because oftentimes the study will be saying something remarkably different, or it'll have all sorts of context that explains that statistic, but the statistic itself is taken out of that context and abused. So basically, if there's a suspicious claim, follow the source or follow the footnotes to the original source. Are there supporting studies and data on it? So if there's a one-off study claiming something, let's say that permitless carry reduces crime substantially or something to that effect. And it's the only study saying that, and there's either no other studies on that topic or there's contradicting studies, then you're going to want to treat that claim with extra care, because it could very well be wrong and just an outlier. In fact, some of the best sources for gun violence statistics are in literature reviews or meta-analysis. One of my favorite studies to cite is a 2014 study by Engelmeyer, which analyzed 16 studies and which showed that a gun in the home doubles the risk of homicide and triples the risk of suicide. So 16 different studies they were analyzing there. And so while any one study might have various flaws and limitations, when you combine the entire research and examine that, it can come to much stronger conclusions that are safer to make. Finally, do the data make sense? So if a study, even if it's in peer review, makes an outlandish claim that just flies in the face of evidence, doing a gut check on it actually is a good way of telling that, like, hey, this study might have substantial issues here. And this can often be done, like, for example, with Gary Kleck's defensive gun use numbers, like 2.5 million defensive gun uses every year. That would mean somewhere like 5,000 or so, never do math on a live Zoom call, are occurring daily, which is like 100 plus or so hourly. There should be some evidence of that out there, and yet there isn't. And so just thinking logically about those things can be a great way of telling, like, hey, does this study actually make sense? Is there an actual causal pathway here? And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the author of the data John Lott? Like, because if he is on almost any subject, particularly gun violence, you can just dismiss it 9 times out of 10.
So I guess this question is sort of a 2-part question. So how do we best use data? And then obviously, if we're looking to use it, it's inevitable that we are going to come across misinformation at some point. So how do we counter that misinformation when we do come across it?
So a couple months ago, we did a GVPedia Explorers on this very topic, dedicated an entire hour to the question. And we have uploaded it to our YouTube page. So if you haven't already watched it, go ahead, check it out there. And it provides an excellent overview of misinformation and what the best psychological tools are to counter such misinformation. And it's just hard. You can, when trying to counter it, you can produce a backlash effect if you aren't careful. If you just let the misinformation ride, it can spread. So there's no good, simple answers. However, like rough guidelines, but basically you should use data as a part of a comprehensive strategy. Entering a discussion with just data alone is not going to be sufficient. I have no illusions that like GVPedia data alone or data alone more broadly is going to solve gun violence. However, it's an important piece of that overall strategy to use. So making sure you have accurate data and combine that with personal stories and other methods of persuasion is going to be important. Countering misinformation, I at least have found, and there's psychological research to back this up, is best done in personal conversations, one-on-one or in a small group, face-to-face, basically talking through misinformation and showing here's how it's false. And these conversations can often take hours individually, and there usually need to be multiple conversations in order to persuade somebody. Another way to, in a more public setting, is letters to the editor. So if they publish something wrong, counter it, because it's not going to be a debate between you and the person providing the misinformation. But if you just let the misinformation sit there, people might accept that. And so it needs to be at least challenged in a way that's not elevating the misinformation. So if the misinformation occurs in a source that nobody's ever heard of, and only QAnon supporters are going to watch it or listen to it, there's no real need to counter it. Like, you're not going to be able to reach those people anyway. But when it comes into the mainstream media and where a broader audience can find something, some pushback's going to be necessary. And perhaps the most important part is avoid online style arguments. Like, the number of people I've been able to convince that they were wrong in an online setting, I can count on no hands. It just doesn't happen. Like, online forums are the place that persuasion goes to die. And in fact, it very often calcifies misinformation and allows it to grow and spread even more due to the backlash effect. So, like, just engaging in online flame wars doesn't really convince anybody. Now, it can be certainly fun. It can be a great activity for the entire family. But in terms of persuading people, it's not going to happen through that mechanism.
Excuse me, as we often ask in these questions, why does all of this matter?
Yes. So why does it matter? Well, we've seen several examples just in the past couple of weeks. There is the court case that frankly, or thankfully today was stayed in California that had overturned their assault weapons ban. The full court's now going to hear it. But in that court case, the Judge Benitez made several outright false claims in it. For example, he talked about how defensive gun use is quite common, with 700,000 to 3.6 million occurring annually. He talked about how using an assault weapon for self-defense is surely more common than using an assault weapon in mass shootings, which, according to Gun Violence Archive data, is untrue, and something I pointed out in an article I published in The Hill last week. And so misinformation, while alone probably wasn't sufficient to explain the judge's position, it certainly played a key role in helping him arrive at a mistaken conclusion. We've also seen this in the growing fight over permitless carry. More and more states are adopting it. Texas had the great misfortune of having permitless carry passed this year. Utah did as well, I believe. And there's more than 20 states now that have permitless carry. And permitless carry is based off of the defensive gun use myth and the idea that more guns in public are going to reduce crime, both of which are data errors and based on flawed studies. And while lawmakers could have potentially still pushed for permitless carry, if that misinformation weren't so prevalent and common, it would be less likely that people would be convinced that permitless carry was a good idea. Also, in the past year, and it's continued into this year as well, we've had a surge of gun buyers from across the political spectrum, across demographics, buying guns because they believe having a firearm is going to make them safer, which is simply not the case. And while the misinformation and academic studies alone don't explain that surge, it certainly is a contributing factor. And we need to be able to counter that sort of misinformation in order to make progress and have people realize that gun ownership does not make them safer. If they realize that, they can either sell their guns back or take proper precautionary measures to make sure that they're storing the firearms as safely as possible and have the necessary training. And also, gun violence is surging. It's been surging since 2019. 2020 was an exceptionally bad year for gun violence, and particularly mass shootings. And 2021 looks to be even worse on those metrics. And it's a growing problem that's going to be made worse over the coming years by the surge of gun buyers, even though many of those guns won't show up on crime scenes in the next year or so, over 5-10 years, when you have more than 200,000 guns being stolen annually. It's going to have a long-term impact that's going to be devastating. And in order to counter that, while data is not the only part of that solution, it needs to be an integral part of it.
So can you tell us about what GVPedia's future plans are for the data space?
Yes, I'm going to stop share and then reshare to show very first one. Yes. So this is a project that we've been working on for the past 2 to 3 years. And we've been going through various prototypes, trying to figure out what works best and how to expand it and grow it over the coming years. And so this is the very first stage of the project that we're hoping to release publicly in the next few months. And this first part is basically a sentence and a map. Now, and it's what the sentence and map allow us to do that's important. Right now, we're looking at how many incidents are there in the US from 2013 to 2019 with any weapon involving any type of shooting in which more than 0 people are shot. Now, right now, this data is just on mass shootings from 2013 to 2019, so we can test the data and make sure everything's working smoothly, but we do plan on incorporating all of gun violence archive data. And so right now we're able to see a map of the US where these incidents occurred. And let's look at California, for example, and zoom in. We can look at the Los Angeles area and see on a street-by-street basis where these mass shootings occurred, the date, how many people were killed or injured, and the congressional district that it occurred in. And so we're able to do this anywhere, zooming in and out, and we're also able to manipulate what type of data we're looking at. So for example, we can switch this to just Texas, which I'll pick on like every good Oklahoman. Give it just a moment. I have not updated it in a bit. And we're able to see just the data for Texas. There's 144 mass shootings from 2013 to 2019. And we can look, for example, at El Paso and see the El Paso shooting in 2019. that killed 22 and injured 24. We can also clarify the search to see, for example, I need to screen. We can look at ones that involved an assault weapon. There's 14 incidents in mass shootings in Texas that involved an assault weapon, including the El Paso shooting over there and multiple shootings in the Houston area. We can manipulate the dates, the type of incidents, whether it's 4 or more people shot or killed or injured. We can also switch this to look at how many victims there were. In those 14 incidents, there's 179 victims. And so we're able to just go through the data like this for mass shootings and eventually all shootings. And again, this is just the first component of this project. We're planning on adding in charts and graphs that allow people to analyze the data, allow people to drill into the data. We also plan to have a functionality to where you can download a PDF report based on this data. And so show you all the charts and graphs and the map and any sort of other information you want on, say, Texas or assault weapons shootings. And basically what would take dozens or hundreds of queries in the gun violence archive and days upon days to piece it all together, you'll be able to do with a few clicks of a button with this tool. And from there, we plan on incorporating the rest of gun violence, or not just gun violence archive data, but also CDC data, potentially FBI data as well, and tie in the other components of GVPedia to where if you want to look at defensive gun use, for example, GVPedia will be able to provide you with the gun violence archive data on how many occurred and where. It will show you the academic studies on defensive gun use. It will show you our white papers, fact sheets, and other information on defensive gun use all packaged together that you can then download and use for your own information. And so that's the project we're going to be working on for over the coming months and years till we're able to perfect it and provide basically a one-stop source for gun violence information. And so that's our plan over the next couple of years and how GVPedia ties into the data landscape.
And it's particularly exciting because, like you said, this is something that if you wanted to create your own report, let's say for the state that you live in, to present to folks working on legislation or someone giving testimony, let's say, that might take you quite a few hours, days, weeks, months to put together. And so the ability for individuals and smaller organizations to be able to populate that data is really exciting and hopefully useful for everyone. And along the same lines is that one of the questions that we received is about data on a state-by-state basis. So as you showed there, you honed in specifically on Texas. But this question was, how is gun violence data collection done on a state-by-state basis? And how is it best to use such state-level data?
Yes. So there's that. And I'm also going to tie in one of the questions in chat. Are you aware of county level data sources on demographics, crime, et cetera, that are being developed?
Yes, perfect.
Depending on what state you're in, the state level health authority can often provide detailed information, I believe, on a county basis, depending on what state you're in. So it's not comprehensive. It's not every state, and some states just won't get back to you if you request data. But that's one good way. The NVDRs provides, I believe it's to the county level on certain data sources. And also if you're able to, and this was a trick I learned from Delaware, if you combine that sort of data with census tract data, you can actually overlay the two sources and you can figure out suicides at essentially a county level. Otherwise, like, you're stuck at looking at suicides on a state level. And for various crime sources, I'm pretty confident the FBI provides county level sources, although again, those aren't necessarily comprehensive and do have some data flaws in them that academics have been aware of since the 1990s, but to my knowledge have not been corrected yet. So there definitely are county level and state level sources there. Just treat them with care. For data relating to gun deaths, the CDC is still going to be the best source there, but again, it's going to be at the state level for narrowing it down within a state. FBI using NVDRs data, and then gun violence archive data is going to be the best bet there.
Thank you. And another question we received is a fellow from Missouri once said to me, quote, "You Democrats always want proof," end quote. How will using data help change their mind, someone's mind?
As part of an overall strategy. So like just like saying, you're wrong, here's the 10 academic papers that I have lying around, prove that you're wrong, go read them. Like it's not going to be all that helpful. So I typically find it's best combined with like personal stories, not necessarily from the same person. So you can have like a survivor tell their story, and activists tell about like their community and the impact that firearms are having on them. And then you can provide the data as well to show like, so you're basically showing like, hey, here's the personal side of the problem, here's what we're doing with it, and here's the data that indicates this isn't just like a one-off thing. Because one of the problems I often see is that people either go into a situation with just the personal story or just the data. And if you go in with just the personal story, it's like, well, if you only had a gun, you could have avoided this. And if you don't have the data to back that up, like, then it's going to be problematic trying to refute that point. Whereas if you just bring in the data and say like, well, 40,000 people died from gun violence last year. There's an old saying that like one person dying is a tragedy, 40,000 people dying is a statistic. And it's unfortunate, but people's like emotional centers just tend to turn off when you're dealing with large numbers. People aren't able to visualize it or grasp it and can grow quite numb very quickly. And so it's a delicate balancing act, but one that needs to be had. And unfortunately, there aren't too many quick and easy solutions, but I would highly recommend you look at our GVPedia Explorers with Evan, because there was a lot of great information there.
Yes, and I just posted the link to that video with Evan in the chat for everyone to see. So if you haven't had an opportunity to watch that, feel free to go check that out. We have a question. How do you recommend combining some of the data sources you mentioned at the beginning?
So for gun violence archive data, if you're going to look at overall gun violence deaths, definitely use CDC suicide data to accompany that. So you can use the gun violence archive death data for homicides and unintentional shootings. That's just fine, but be sure to incorporate the suicide component from the CDC. Like most of them tie back to the CDC. For the NVDRs, you're going to need data from other states. So like the gun violence archive can help fill in there. Overall, do be careful when combining data sources because, well, like for example, even with the CDC data, I forget which precise year it is, but they do have a data jump even there where they recommend you not use data before a certain date and after this certain date in the same data set because they were using two different methodologies. And so while academics can definitely combine various data sources and they often use it for like demographics, so figuring out how many people live in a state, what percent of the population is a female, male, what age, etc. So they combine that sort of demographic information. They combine other crime sources, so they can look at the impact of gun ownership levels or gun violence versus other crimes. So it's typically other sources of data outside of the gun violence data itself. But you can still combine sort of the best gun violence data sources together, particularly CDC with suicides, and then others to help supplement and complement that. And I mentioned earlier that every town had a report on injury data that was, it's definitely more accurate than the CDC numbers, and because it looks at more hospitals and then extrapolates from those. And so using that information on a state basis could be helpful to combine with the CDC data or gun violence archive data to provide a full picture of both deaths and injuries.
Thank you, Devin. Don't see any more questions in the chat, and we are almost out of time anyway, so I'm going to have us wrap up. This session again was being recorded, and I will send it out to everybody shortly, so you have it and can pass it along to anybody who you think might be interested in seeing it. So we're going to keep doing these GVPedia Explains sessions. If you have any topic ideas, something that you've been interested in learning more about, feel free to send those over to us. And as always, if you have any questions about this or anything in general, just reach out to me or to Devin, and we will do our best to help you answer those questions. So thank you for joining us today in this conversation, and we will be in touch soon. And as always, thank you for all the amazing work that you do to bring an end to gun violence here in the United States. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.